Welcome. So, very briefly here, what I want to do is show you an example of what I mean when I say include data. So, the premise of your summary is that someone can read your summary of a primary article and not need to go back to read that primary article, so that you should be able to read the summary you provide and understand what you're doing. So to do that, it's important to be very clear about the dependent and the independent variable in your article after you have read it. But there will be several variables, and it's important that you focus deep on one or on two, the dependent and the independent variable, then try to summarize generally the whole article. If you do that, if you just summarize the whole article in general, your reader will understand what you wrote, but they will not be able to make an informed decision as to whether it should be believed or whether they should change their behavior because of what your summary says. And because a lot of people don't have time to read the whole article, or they can't even understand the whole article, it's important that you include elements of one, the method or the instruments that was used to get the data and what those mean. And two, include the actual data that shows the relationship between your independent or your explanatory variable and your dependent variable. And also interpret that to let your audience know what it means. If I told you, oh, my blood pressure is 200 over 100, to someone who doesn't understand what that means, 200 over 100, not a big deal. But to somebody who understands, oh, you say, oh, you're in a hypertensive crisis. You should go to the emergency right away. So it's important that you let your audience know what the measure means. And finally, now interpret it in your own words. Okay, so I picked this example, this paper as an example of how you might do that. And so the paper is perceived stress, energy drink consumption, and academic performance among college students. Now, notice that this title doesn't tell me what the dependent or the independent is. It just talks about three different variables. And so, for you to understand the goal of the authors, typically, of course, read through the background, but usually at the end of the background, the most articles include the punchline, what it's all about. And so here's the punchline here. Researchers have examined the cognitive, physiological, behavioral effects of energy drink consumption. Okay, we know that. But it now says that that's the punchline, that few, if any, studies have investigated the predisposing determinants of energy drink consumption. So right there, this tells me that energy drink consumption is what we're trying to predict, and so that's the dependent variable. And so they now went on to say that the purpose of this study is to explore relationships regarding three possible variables. For example, stress, academic performance, and energy drink consumption. Then they have a secondary purpose, which is to evaluate differences in perceived stress and energy drink consumption based on gender and school year. So notice here that there are so many different questions being asked. So if you try to summarize the whole thing as like in one page, you cannot set up the arguments for each of these questions adequately, such that your reader will not eventually they will understand your summary, but they can't make an informed decision based off of that summary. So here's what I'm now saying. So the research questions are as follows. Does a relationship exist between perceived stress and energy drink consumption? Those are two clear variables that can be looked at. And so going forward, I'm assume here that my interest is in how what are the factors that predict whether or not people drink energy drinks. And so my dependence is energy drink consumption, and my independence is um, perceived stress. So, which brings up a big question. There must be a way by which I can measure different levels of energy drink. Maybe I'm somebody who drinks one a day, or you are somebody who drinks 10 a day, or you don't drink at all. There must be a way to measure that. And so these guys used a survey. They asked people in a survey. Now, is a survey the only way you can measure that? No, you could probably measure it by looking at their credit card purchases or something, or and things like that. So, but in this case, they used a survey where they asked the participants. The second thing is, how do you measure stress? Well, to find out the answers to those two questions, you have to go to the method section. And in the method section, it shows here that they measured stress using a scale called the perceived stress scale. And this scale has 14 items, 14 questions that people answer, 5-point Likert scale questions. 0 is never, and 4 is very often. And then, if I highly recommend you go ahead and do a Google search for that perceived stress scale, and you can see the kinds of questions he asks. And then it's note here, it says that it talks about the validity of that stress scale, meaning it has been validated. That means it is, the results of that stress scale correlates with people's perceived stress. They have kind of validated that instrument. So that was one. And then they did other surveys, demographics, and energy drink consumption. I'm interested in energy drink consumption. And so they asked, in that survey, there were 6 questions to assess energy drink consumption. And now, do you want to summarize all 6? I don't think so. You don't need to summarize all 6. Pick at least one of those questions and summarize and include that in your summary, in your interpretation. And so in this example, I want to pick this one. Let's say during the past 30 days, on average, how many days per week did you consume energy drinks? So 0 is 0 days, 1 is 1 day, 2 is 2 days. And so that gives me a measure that I can use to qualify people's energy drink consumption behaviors. So now that I know that, then I can look at the data. So I'm going to skip over here now to a guideline or a rubric for how you might do this. Now, I put here 7 things you should include, or you could include. I would say that at least 4 of these, and of course the citation, at least 4 of these should be included in your data, in the data that you include in your summary. And the first one is, let it be clear what the dependent and the independent variables are. And then you quote the relevant data. So if you do this, when you summarize, the summary data is from the results section, not from the abstract, not from the discussion. The data must be relevant and to help the reader understand the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Okay, and you should state the page or table or figure from the data from which the data was obtained. That's a 5 out of 5 score right there. That's what I consider excellent data inclusion. But in some cases, you might just include data, but it's irrelevant data because it's only descriptive data of one of the variables, maybe the dependent variable. It's still data, but it's not data that helps people understand what you are trying to summarize, which is the relationship between energy drink use and stress and perceived stress. So if you did just went ahead and told me there were 400 people in the study, it's still data, but it's irrelevant data. So for that, you might get somewhere between a 0 and a 2.5 out of 5. And then these are the other variables, other things to include. So the instruments, I just talked about that. So let's not just say, stress was higher in men versus women, or stress was higher in those who drank energy drinks and those who did not. Or actually, in this case, um, people that were more stressed drank more energy drinks. While that may be true, um, they did not really measure stress. They measured the perceived stress scale, which is indicative of stress, but it's not stress that they measure. So that's why they're instruments. That's why you have to validate them. They are indicators, um, like a litmus test of stress. And so it's not 100% accurate, but it is valid to some degree. And so we shouldn't just say that, well, this PSS scale is it's the end all be all of stress. Whatever the PSS scale says directly relates to your stress. It does directly relate, but we also have individual variability that doesn't that we still want to interpret this with a grain of salt, with some healthy skepticism at the same time. So talk about what was actually measured, not what it means at this point. And then you should now interpret what that means. Now you can summarize it in your own words and say, oh, well, the guys that were more stressed, they took more energy drinks. At this point, this is interpretation because you've already given me context to let me know how you determined that they were stressed and how you determined how much energy drinks they consumed, and so on. So that's and then at the end you should. So this is an example here that is made available to you that you can use to guide you, and at the end, of course, include the citation in APA style. Okay.